Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlickers, showstones, legislators, peasants, vassals. I'm a useful idiot, and today I want to talk about the fact that we have a conflict developing between the Syrian opposition and the Kurds. And this is potentially a big deal. And so what we have is the last couple of days, 56 people been killed in fighting in northeast Syria between anti-government rebels and members of the oppressed Kurdish minority that make up 10% of the population of Syria. I've brought this up quite a few times before because the general consensus seems to be that there will not be a free Kurdistan because it would be too disruptive for 4 different countries that share a Kurdish population. But I tend to believe that there's going to be geopolitical events that will make the reality of a free Kurdish state more likely than some people seem to think. And so anyway, this only reinforces that. And interestingly enough, tanks and mortars are being used by Syrian rebels against Kurdish forces. So while Arab rebels are fighting the government in the west and the south, now these same Arab rebels and these jihadis and the Syrian opposition and the Free Syrian Army are now operating against government forces and now Kurds in the north as well. So this is a big deal. And it's not surprising considering the sequence of events. Last year there was a Kurdish rebellion, and the Kurdish militias took control of most all of the Kurdish cities in all the northern enclaves in the north and northeast of Syria. And government forces quickly abandoned all those Kurdish areas, left them on their own, and have been fighting the Syrian opposition. And the Kurds very, very quickly set up their own region, their own autonomous governments, and set up their militias, and set up cultural centers and schools and police, and along with these armed militias. So they very quickly took advantage of the situation to plot out their traditional homeland. So this is a huge deal. If this conflict continues and the Syrian rebels have their force dissipated slightly in their struggle against Assad because they want to oppress the Kurds, what an interesting development. And I've done some background on Kurdistan and the Kurdish areas before, particularly as it relates to Turkey, but I haven't talked a whole lot about how the Kurdish population ended up being in this situation in Syria. And there are 2 million Kurds in Syria, which is relatively small compared to the fact that in Iraq there's 6 million, in Iran there's 8 million, and in Turkey there are 14 million Kurds, and they are Sunnis. So once again, it would be to the United States and the West's advantage to have a free Kurdistan, because it would align with all the other Sunni regimes that the United States supports. And the Kurds have been in this region since well before the 11th century, so they have a long history in this area. And just like the other countries in the region, when the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Ottoman Empire, was broken up at the end of World War I, in the early 20th century, the French took over, and they talked about an independent Kurdistan being carved out of Turkey, and would include some of these territory that is now in Syria. But what ended up happening is that this promise was broken, and by 1923 the Allies set up a new treaty that didn't mention anything about an independent Kurdistan. And in fact, Kurdistan was divided up between Turkey and the newly created countries of Syria and Iraq. Iraq was the British mandate, and Syria was the French mandate. So they started dividing up these colonies, these new colonies, in the post-war World War I period. And it's strangely reminiscent of something else we've seen. Not only was the Kurds punished by having their traditional homelands divided up into 3 or 4 artificial new countries, that's the same thing we see more recently with the Tuaregs in Mali. because the Tuaregs, their traditional homeland is divided up between 4 countries in that region, and we find these same patterns over and over again with the colonial borders coming back to haunt us. These ethnic homelands divided up all over the world by colonial powers with no sense of keeping these traditional homelands together. But that makes sense because the strategy, even back then for the imperial powers, and this will also sound familiar, was to divide and conquer, encouraging ethnic rivalries and autonomy so that it would be easier to control these colonies. And that's the same tactic the United States is using in our own era now. We encourage these ethnic rivalries and these autonomy in these different regions. Of course, we've set up the Free Kurdish region in northern Iraq, for one example. And so this is a time-honored tactic of empires. And so after Kurdistan's independence was ignored and these mandates were set up, by the 60s, Syria got their independence and they immediately oppressed the Kurdish minority. And Iraq and Syria, as a matter of fact, militarily crushed a Kurdish uprising in Iraq, Kurdistan back in the 60s. So just as now we have an autonomous Kurdish region in northern Iraq back in the 60s, there was an attempt to create an independent Iraqi Kurdistan, and both Iraq and Syria recognized the threat and crushed the rebellion militarily. So this is a struggle that has a long, long history. And after that, of course, various draconian laws were used to oppress the Kurds even further. In fact, at one point, they were all stripped of their citizenship. And then in 2004, there was a massacre of Kurds called the Kamishli massacre. And oddly enough, over a Kurd versus Arab soccer match. But impending violence escalated everything. So there's a little more historical background on the Kurds that are in Syria. And just as predicted, they are filling the vacuum. The government has abandoned them. They've spent the better part of this last year filling the vacuum, setting up their own cultural centers, their schools, their police, their armed militia. They have created their own military force there. And now we find a huge turn of events in Syria as Syrian rebels now having to fight Kurdish separatists. So this is getting even more complicated, and it'll be interesting to see what happens with the continuing unfolding destiny of the Kurdish people. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.